David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, if we're not careful, the United States is soon going to be at war with Iran. And this is, of course, the same Iran that has stuck to every provision of the Iran nuclear deal until, of course, Donald Trump decided to void that deal unilaterally. And I told you earlier this week that Donald Trump is adding sanctions to Iran. Iran has done what any rational actor would do in that situation, which is they said, well, listen, we didn't break the deal. We stuck to the conditions of the deal. If you are unilaterally voiding the deal and you are adding sanctions to us, then we'll go back to researching and developing nuclear technology, which could be used for weapons. And I think it's important for me to restate, in case there are any bad faith actors out there waiting to pounce on me, I don't want Iran to develop nuclear weapons. I don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. I have not been someone who has claimed ever, I would argue, that the Iranian forces of power are good faith actors. I have not said or done, or nor do I want any of those things. But this is obviously the logical decision if you are in Iran's position as a result of Donald Trump's decisions. And now Donald Trump is starting to scale up hostilities. And Donald Trump is trying to end all Iranian oil, steel, and copper exports. Iran is now heading closer and closer towards an economic crisis. And now the pre-war propaganda starts. And I don't know what's true and what isn't, to be perfectly honest with you. United States officials are now claiming that Iran is preparing military strikes against the United States in the Middle East. They say that that Iran is getting ready for attacking commercial and military ships in the Persian Gulf. Could it be true? Sure, absolutely. Is it actually true? I don't know. The United States has a long history of having leaders that lie to us about so-called imminent threats to create military engagements for what they perceive to be political benefit. U.S. intelligence also seems to be making the assessment that Iran's actions might be to deliberately goad Trump into taking action, since those actions could be politically problematic for Donald Trump and for the United States, given our almost constant disastrous involvement in the region for decades at this point in time. And there's the risk that that could be bad for Donald Trump politically, although at the same time, it could be good for Trump politically to get involved in a conflict with Iran. You may have heard over the weekend that there were 4 attacks on oil tankers in the Persian Gulf. They have not as of yet been blamed on Iran. It's under investigation, according to our Secretary of State. And the Trump administration has very quickly shifted into reviewing military plans for Iran, which are starting to smell like and starting to look like and starting to sound like the pre-Iraq war era and the lead up that eventually got us, I think it was about 130,000 troops in Iraq. And in fact, a very similar number, a plan being presented to Donald Trump, which would move 120,000 American troops to the Middle East if Iran attacks American soldiers or ramps up nuclear development or does the other things that the Trump administration claims Iran is thinking about doing or preparing to do. We heard from Trump National Security Advisor John Bolton, who's right in there with this plan of going into Iran. And he has been an Iran war hawk for a long time. And in fact, he wanted to go into Iran when he worked for George W. Bush, and he was not able to convince George W. Bush to do it. We thought maybe his presence as national security advisor would give him another shot. And it seems that we're closer than we have been at any other point during the Trump presidency to John Bolton getting that opportunity. And we're talking about a serious engagement here. Okay, 120,000 troops. That's not a 1,500 troop peacekeeping or training mission. This is a large scale operation that has been presented to Trump. There are articles which are using the term drifting. We're drifting towards war with Iran. That's not the right imagery. Trump has been pushing us towards war with Iran ever since he decided to bail on the Iran nuclear deal without Iran having done anything to deserve that. And the hilarious thing is that now Trump administration officials have started to pay lip service to things like, you know, we would prefer a diplomatic solution with Iran, but we can't take anything off the table. It would be bad strategy to take military action off the table. We had a diplomatic solution. It was the Iran nuclear deal, which diplomat Barack Obama put in place, and Donald Trump has unilaterally voided without good cause. And so when the newspapers cover this, including the Washington Post and the New York Times, who have done very good investigative work over the last several years, the newspapers covering this need to stop playing coy with the language. Drifting towards war is very passive language in a way. Considering what a plan might look like, the United States is the party that is causing this, not the party reacting to what Iran is doing. Everything Iran has done, and I am no defender of Iran by any means. I've been hugely critical of the regime there. What Iran is doing is the obvious reaction to what the Trump administration has done. This is all on us, and specifically on the Trump administration because of his actions. And the Washington Post and the New York Times should just say in their op-eds that Trump is pushing us towards war, not that there is this passive sort of floating in the ocean drift in that direction. No more pussyfooting. Let's actually tell it like it is, because that's what's going on, and it's really bad. Let's talk about Elizabeth Warren. 2020 Democratic candidate Elizabeth Warren has refused an invitation to do a town hall on Fox News. And there's a lot to discuss here. And I'm very interested in many of the elements that are going on here. So you might remember that not long ago, weeks, was it a couple months, time's flying, 2020 Democratic candidate Bernie Sanders did a Fox News town hall. And he absolutely crushed it. He had the entire room clapping for Medicare for all. He schooled the moderators, Martha McCallum and Brett Baer, on everything from healthcare to taxes to economics. I mean, really just everything. It went really, really well for Bernie Sanders, and it went really poorly for Fox News. Elizabeth Warren has been invited to do her own town hall on Fox News, and she's taking a different approach. She has turned it down, and she says Fox News is a hate-for-profit racket that gives a megaphone to racists and conspiracists, which of course is completely true. But there's still a question of whether Elizabeth Warren might benefit in the net by appearing on Fox News and talking about what are mostly very good ideas that she has, as compared to ignoring Fox News altogether. Now, this is so funny. There are people attacking me on Twitter already. Like, I haven't even commented on the Elizabeth Warren Fox News town hall thing. I'm commenting on it now. And people are tweeting me saying, David, you are going to be a hypocrite because you praised Bernie Sanders for doing the town hall, and you're going to praise Elizabeth Warren for not doing the town hall. But remember, what I said when Bernie did the town hall is I think that there are two legitimate perspectives here. Do the town hall knowing that Fox News is the propaganda arm of the Trump administration, because you're making the calculation that you'd rather reach some portion of their audience that is convincible, even though it's a total hate-for-profit racket, as Elizabeth Warren points out. That's a legitimate idea, legitimate point of view. It's also legitimate to say, I'm not going to implicitly or explicitly give attention to this propaganda network, nor allow them to use me to continue their hate-for-profit racket. Both are legitimate, but you don't have to take my word for it. Let's actually look at what I said the day I covered the Bernie Sanders town hall. But there were sort of two main arguments leading up to this about whether Bernie Sanders should or shouldn't appear. The argument against Bernie appearing is a very simple one, which is Fox News is the propaganda arm of the Trump administration. It is not going to be a town hall that is sort of fairly set up. It is going to be an audience that is going to have handpicked people from political groups, including Turning Point USA, which happened. It's going to be one that most likely will turn into a two-on-one sort of argument between two Fox News moderators and Bernie Sanders, which it did. And it's a net loss. Don't give them the ratings by appearing. That was the argument against Bernie appearing. On the other side, the argument for Bernie appearing is, listen, these are people who otherwise may never even get a real understanding from Bernie himself about what his policies are. Most people, not in the physical audience, but in the Fox News television audience, probably are not going to be voting for the Democrat in November of 2020. But if Bernie can convince just 1 or 2% of the people in the audience, it's worthwhile, and he could reach people that otherwise will never have anything break their echo chamber, pierce their propaganda, and therefore it's worth Bernie appearing. Both are respectable and defensible points of view. So again, both are legitimate strategies. Each candidate should handle it how they see fit. They don't owe Fox News anything. Their calculation should be, what do they want to do? How do they want to use Fox News, if at all, to push their agenda and to push their platform? And if they don't want to do it, that's perfectly reasonable. Now, there will be all of the normal responses to Elizabeth Warren's decision that we can imagine and we would expect. Elizabeth Warren is scared, or she's avoiding debates in town halls. Well, Elizabeth Warren has done endless town halls, and she's faced countless questions. She recently took questions completely unprepared when her plane from, I believe it was D.C. or LaGuardia to Charleston, I believe it was, got very, very delayed. She held an impromptu town hall. She's faced questions from adversarial people and people on her side, saying that in particular, she believes Fox News is a bad faith actor is very different than saying she's afraid of or won't participate in town halls or adversarial interviews. You also have to consider, and this is something that I've not seen talked about since this story broke, given how poorly the Bernie Sanders town hall went for Fox News. I mean, a room full of people clapping for Medicare for all and clapping for Bernie Sanders on Fox News. That's not great for Fox News. I would be shocked if Fox allowed an Elizabeth Warren town hall to go the same way that the Bernie Sanders town hall went. My guess is that they would be much more prepared to really make her look bad in a way that they were unable to make Bernie Sanders look bad. Now, Elizabeth Warren is smart enough and quick enough that she still would probably do okay, but I think that that's also probably a consideration. In the last 7 days, as you may have noticed, I have been pushed more and more in the direction of Elizabeth Warren. I still find her quite uncharismatic on a personality level. I don't see her really connecting with large swaths of voters particularly well. But as I told you yesterday, her policy proposals are detailed. Most of them I agree with, although I have some questions about some of them. And since the fiasco that was the handling of her DNA test, she has been making many of the right decisions. And I would be glad to vote for her against Donald Trump. And I would be glad to vote for Bernie Sanders against Donald Trump as well. Many similarities between the two, important differences, which we've discussed. But there are some significantly good candidates that are running right now on the Democratic side. And good for Elizabeth Warren and this entire, by the way, this may have inadvertently had the very successful popularizing of the term hate for profit racket about Fox News, which has sort of instantly been mainstreamed and has appeared in all sorts of articles and commentaries. So good for Elizabeth Warren, good for Bernie Sanders. I respect both of their decisions, but I would like to hear from you. Do you think Elizabeth Warren is making the correct decision given all of the circumstances, or would you rather see her? Do you think it would be the right decision for her to do the Fox News town hall? Let me know on Twitter at @DPakman. Make sure you're following me and follow the show as well at David Pakman Show. We'll take a quick break and be back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Adam Eberly. I also want to say thanks to James Greiner, who is our sustaining longtime member of the day. James has been with us almost 5 years, all the way back to 2014. Really appreciate both of you, Adam and James. Membership is the #1 funding source for the show. It's very inexpensive and can be even cheaper if you use the coupon code THISIS2020 when you sign up. That'll save you 40% off of the membership of your choice. But there are other ways to support the show, including on Patreon at patreon.com/David Pakman Show, where support starts at just $1 per month. You can become a YouTube channel member. You can send super chats during live streams, but still the primary funding source remains membership at www.joinpakman.com. I actually may have to. We have had such an influx of new members that I may have to start doubling up and thanking 2 new members and a longtime sustaining member every day, just to try to get caught up. I think we're like more than a year behind right now on new member thank yous. And that's a great problem to have. And I really appreciate the fact that you guys have all put us in that position. Okay, it is time for Hatriot Mail. What is Hatriot Mail? This is Hatriot Mail.
So what if the president's been accused of sexual harassment 15 times? Or that he paid hush money to a porn star? At least he never wore a tan suit. Hatriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman. Because America. And because freedom.
That's right. Hatriot Mail is when a professional voiceover artist interprets the hate mail that I get. And there is a lot of interpretation to be done with this week's Hatriot Mail. Take a listen to it.
David Pakman. Liar, 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 liar. You are very sick and disgusting, David Pakman. Shame on you, the weak apologist Jew. Total beta pansy. What a shameful how are, David. You shame the name, David. Whine and play the victim. Beta!
Yeah, this whole beta thing has really picked up, and I actually don't know when it started exactly. Like, did beta? I don't think it stemmed from the Trump presidency, although I think it was significantly popularized. I think the whole alpha male, beta male thing has maybe surfaced in the same vein as the sort of soy boy ad hominems of the left. But I don't even, maybe men's rights activism has a role to play in this whole alpha beta thing. But it's all incredibly stupid and wildly immature, which makes it perfect for Hatriots. Send a middle finger salute to the Hatriots by becoming a member on our website and using the coupon code Hatriot40, okay? The coupon code Hatriot40, which I'll spell for you in a moment, saves you 40% off of any membership. And it's a direct signal. It's a message to the Hatriots that they can use whatever homophobic slurs they want in their messages to me. They can use whatever anti-Semitic slurs they want. They can use whatever emasculating terms they think will trigger me that they want. You are not going to be bullied, and you are actually going to say, I support progressive independent media like the David Pakman Show, and using the coupon code Hatriot40 when you become a member sends exactly that message. The coupon code is spelled Hatriot 40, and it'll save you 40% and make many Hatriots cry at the impotence of their attacks on me. Okay, there is a renewed war against abortion, and there is a very specific reason why. I told you about this. I told you that this would happen as soon as Donald Trump got his first selection to the Supreme Court. And it was renewed even more strongly as soon as Donald Trump got his second selection to the Supreme Court. Brett Kavanaugh, the religious right, the social conservatives, the anti-choice activists, they have seized upon the reality, and it is a reality, that they have a potential opportunity here with this Supreme Court to undo decades of progress on abortion rights, also known as medical rights, also known as women's rights, also known as legal medical procedures. And the reason that they've correctly identified that this is an opportunity unlike one that they've had in a long time is that we now have, thanks to the election of Donald Trump, one of the most conservative Supreme Courts in a long time. Now, remember, there were some people, I'm not going to name names because that's not productive, but there were people who in 2015 and in 2016, in the lead up to the 2016 election, were saying, I don't care if it's Trump or Hillary. Hillary is a centrist Democrat. You might as well elect Trump. It's not going to be any different. Well, Exhibit A as to why that's laughably absurd and malignantly ignorant is the Supreme Court, which now will have an influence on American political society and society beyond just politics for decades, is Exhibit A. And the abortion battle, the renewed abortion battle, is one of the great examples of that, which gets us to, I mean, this is all just contextualizing for you, that we now have had votes from the Alabama House of Representatives and yesterday from the Alabama Senate approving a measure to outlaw abortion in Alabama. This would outlaw almost every abortion in the state. It would ban abortions at all points in time in pregnancy. It would criminalize doctors performing abortions with felonies and up to 99 years in prison. No exceptions for cases of rape. No exceptions for cases of incest. This is a dark ages law, and it includes just one exception for when the woman's life is at risk. So this is meant to be a direct challenge to Roe v. Wade at the Supreme Court level if things go the way they want. Now, you might say, why is this happening in Alabama? Well, yes, I mean, Alabama is a more socially conservative and religious state in the sense that they want to punish gays and abortions, which are popular priorities for the religious right in the United States right now. And of course, it's happening in a state that is a disaster. I'm not insulting the people. What I'm telling you is that Alabama has serious problems to fix. And what they're choosing to do is to outlaw basically every abortion. The college graduation rate is extraordinarily low in Alabama. They are dead last. They are 50th in education in Alabama. They are 46th in healthcare. Their economy is 45th out of 50 in the United States. Opportunity is 45th out of 50 in the United States. Crime is 45th out of 50th in the United States. Infrastructure is 38th. And so what do? They say, let's ban all abortions. So let's break it down one step at a time. Is this bill likely to become the law? Yes, sort of, but probably not immediately. What I mean by that is that it's been passed by the House of Representatives in the House in Alabama. It's been passed by the Senate. It's believed that Alabama's Governor Kay Ivey, obviously a Republican, is going to sign it, although Governor Ivey's office has not yet, at least as of 5 minutes ago, put out a statement one way or the other. But there's the expectation that Kay Ivey is going to sign it. So it sounds like it'll become the law, right? Well, not so fast. This is part of the long-term anti-abortion strategy. More than likely, if and when the governor signs this into law, there will immediately be a lawsuit filed demanding an injunction. And the idea here is to try to get that case all the way up to the Supreme Court in order to try to federally challenge abortion. The way it will go is Kay Ivey signs it into law. It's immediately challenged in federal court. And more than likely, because this is such an extreme piece of legislation, the first court that will hear the appeal may likely block the law. Okay, a lot of legal experts are saying that first court is likely to block the law. And that's the whole point of this for the anti-choice activists who want to have it blocked or expect it to be blocked at the first court challenge. They will then appeal the law, ideally all the way up to the Supreme Court, at which point Brett Kavanaugh's replacement of centrist Justice Anthony Kennedy could be the difference maker in allowing a major precedent-setting anti-abortion decision by the Supreme Court. So I've got to hand it to them, okay? I think these people are disgusting. I think their priorities are backwards. They are dead last in education in Alabama. They are, I gave you the list already. I truly find these to be despicable people with all of the wrong priorities. But they're pretty clever. And they knew, when Mitch McConnell participated in obstructing Barack Obama's selection of Merrick Garland to the court, that was step one of this long-term strategy. And so we've got to praise the right. We've got to recognize good strategy. They were able to have a multi-year plan. Okay, it was a year before the 2016 election, and McConnell starts with, well, we should really let the voters have a say before we decide who's going to be on the Supreme Court potentially for decades. That stretched into the 2016 election. And then Trump got his replacement. And then they negotiated a departure for Anthony Kennedy under potentially nebulous circumstances. And then in comes Brett Kavanaugh. And then they start with the state level stuff. And they're better than us. They're better than us. That's the reality. We have to understand that they are better than us. And we're only going to do better than them if we accept how good they actually are and figure out how to fight against this stuff. So we'll see what happens. This could be the beginning of significant precedent-setting abortion-related rulings by one of the most conservative Supreme Courts in a long time, which if that happens, the next part of the strategy is immediately that Supreme Court decision, which may stem from an appeal from this Alabama law or the one recently moving forward in Georgia, then multiple states will pass similar laws to this one, and it would be a massive rollback of abortion rights. And if you're surprised by this, if you're appalled by this, this is exactly what we knew their plan was as soon as they realized that Donald Trump had the opportunity of putting more conservative justices on the Supreme Court. And once again, it's already almost 2020. If Trump wins, he likely will get at least one more pick to the Supreme Court. Yet another reason we got to get rid of this guy, and we got to get rid of this guy right away. Let me know what you think. You can follow me on Instagram at david.pacman. Also follow The David Pakman Show on Instagram at David Pakman Show. Polls, behind the scenes pictures, opportunities for you to ask me questions, all of that great stuff. We'll take a quick break. Part 2 of my interview with the great Cal Newport is coming up next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
We're continuing our conversation today with Cal Newport, who is a computer science professor at Georgetown University, also author of several books, including the brand new Digital Minimalism, Choosing a Focused Life in a Noisy World. Cal, I've already adopted a lot of the techniques that you talk about in the book. And not only did I tell my staff that I was doing this, I actually told my audience as well. I told my audience I am significantly going to be limiting my engagement on Twitter, partially because when you do political stuff, it's extraordinarily toxic and mostly negative, anti-Semitic comments in my particular case. But for anybody, I would argue what you were talking about in digital minimalism would really serve both attention spans as well as just sort of general emotional health. So let's start there. What is the most important way that we should understand the effect of this endless scrolling, what I call the operant conditioning variable rewards mechanism that social media has? Why is that bad for us?
Well, there's a couple things going on. One is these apps have been engineered to foster compulsive use. And so what happens is at first it becomes an easy distraction. And then over time, it becomes a replacement for other activities that are more meaningful and more satisfying. And therefore, more and more of your discretionary time gets funneled into what are essentially these virtual data factories where you sit here scrolling, helping the revenue numbers of 3 or 4 companies, while other parts of your life that are more important and more meaningful get neglected. And then there's the actual content and engagement when you're actually looking at these screens. Some of what you do on these screens is fine. It's good for you. I mean, there's nothing specifically negative about, let's say, sending a comment to a relative of yours about what they're up to. But because the algorithms behind a lot of these news feeds or Twitter feeds are optimized for engagement, there's this sort of darker side of what you're actually looking at, where just like you talked about with your experience in Twitter, that it pulls you towards extremism, it pulls you towards darkness, it pulls you towards a place of feeling socially uneasy or unhappy, which eventually makes these things, I like to think of them as unhappiness generating machines.
There are people who will put in place sort of protocol like a weekly digital Sabbath. On Saturday, I don't touch any of my technology or I don't look at any social networks. Or when I'm on vacation, I will get completely off of them or whatever the case may be. The problem I have with that, or the concern I have, is that it's sometimes used to justify really unhealthy social media behaviors all of the other time, because you're saying, hey, listen, Saturdays I'm doing the thing that I think is better for me, or once a year I'm doing this other thing. How important are these sort of every once in a while cleanses, so to speak, versus just kind of like maintaining healthy habits throughout the year?
I think they're a terrible idea. I mean, if you want my opinion, if I had a friend, let's say, who during the week was abusing alcohol and was causing lots of negative impacts in their life, if they came to me and said, don't worry, I have this great plan, I'm not going to drink on Saturdays. I would say I think you're missing the bigger problem here. The fact that you have something that's such a negative force in your life that you feel the need to schedule escapes from is perhaps evidence that this is a problem that needs a more systematic solution, which is why in my book, I talk about a digital declutter as opposed to a digital detox. I think people in the substance abuse community, for example, are really upset about the way that the word detox has been co-opted into this digital world to mean something that's really different than the original meaning, which is just let's take a break from something that's giving us trouble. I talk in terms of decluttering, because when you're decluttering, you're not taking a break from all of the extra stuff you have in your house. You're getting rid of it. And I think that's what we really need.
The idea of turning off notifications from apps, I mean, does that even register as a significant change that people can make, or is it just not nearly anything?
Basically, what I discovered is these smaller hacks like notifications, making your screen grayscale, moving where your apps are into folders on the second screen of your iPhone, or these digital wellness tools where you see like a tree that's dying or something every time you pick up your phone, they're not cutting it. I think the cultural and technological forces that are drawing people back to their screen too much and making them unhappy are way too strong to throw assorted hacks and tricks at it. And this has been my observation. We've tried this for about 5 or 6 years now, and it's really not working.
There are studies that claim to be able to assess the sort of degree of negative or positive impact of different online platforms. There's one that's been talked about quite a bit, which says of all the online platforms that were looked at, YouTube was the only one that seemed to have like a net benefit for people in terms of well-being, and that every other one, with Instagram being the absolute and total worst, have a net negative impact on people's emotions and psyche, et cetera. What's your sense of sort of looking at the nitty gritty of these individual platforms, or do you think that kind of misses the boat?
I don't think it does. And so if you take a minimalist approach to these technologies, which is what I suggest, it says you start with identifying what really matters to you, what you want to spend your time on, what you value. And then you work backwards and say, is there some way to deploy technology that's going to give me a big win on one of these particular values? And then you ignore everything else. And so depending on what those values are, there may be a very specific technology, maybe even a technology that makes some people really unhappy that works for you. So a common example I came across, for example, were visual artists. It turns out if you're a visual artist, what you need, the main fuel for your work is creative input. You have to see other work from other artists in a similar type of genre. And Instagram has been great for this. So now for the first time, if you're a visual artist, you can look at other artists' works remotely without having to live in one or two cities that happens to have a major gallery scene. So it's been a powerful democratizing force. So if you're a visual artist, the careful use of Instagram, let's say every week expose yourself to a carefully curated list of artists, is very positive. On the other hand, if you're, say 22-year-old college grad, kind of unhappy and adrift, Instagram could be a massive source of negative energy and distraction. And so I don't like to think about good technologies and bad technologies. I like to think about good uses of your time, good values, and bad, and putting the technology to work for the former.
Along those lines, you talk in both digital minimalism and deep work, I think, although I'm going sort of from memory here, about the power of sometimes just saying no. And you describe something that I encounter a lot, which is I'll get a request in my email. And I really do think of every email I get as a request on my time, right? That's the sort of starting point. Requests were, hey, David, would you be willing to participate in some kind of a 6-person panel or whatever? And really, the answer is just like no. The correct answer is no. The right answer, given where I am at any particular point in time in my career and personal life, is no. But through some combination of like guilt and maybe the fear of missing out, I'll sort of say no, but also say, but what I can do is give you some ideas for good questions for the panel, for example. And what I'm effectively doing is volunteering myself to do something where I'm losing all of the possible benefit of being involved, but still committing some of my time. Talk a little bit about the hesitancy that society has bred into us to be afraid or hesitant to just say no when a straight no is really kind of the right answer for us.
Well, part of this is an unintentional consequence of introducing low-friction digital communication into the world. A lot of our issues with technology in general are unintentional because we take things that have been evolved into us in another context and then we introduce these new tools. And so in a tribal context, if it's here's my tribe and there's 10 of us, We're wired to be very wary of social reciprocity. If someone else in the tribe says, hey, can you help me, whatever, carry my spears over to where we're hunting the mastodon, you're probably gonna say, I probably should do that if I can, just like you would if a family member wanted your help in the morning to, with something that's going on. Because in small tribal context, social reciprocity is important for knitting together the social fabric. Now, when you introduce into the picture the sort of universal low friction digital communication like email, which means sort of anyone in the country can now send you a message and try to request some of your time and attention. We still have that same instinct to do social reciprocity, but it doesn't scale because now there's hundreds of thousands of people now in this tribe who could be making these requests. And so what we really have is this collision on our Paleolithic social instincts versus our technological digital world, and they're clashing. And these clashes cause a lot of the problems we have. And when it comes to this particular issue, we do want to help because that is our instinct. But once we get rid of this friction, probably the right framework is Kant's categorical imperative, right? The way that he tried to build up morality from scratch. He said the real question was, what happens if I take this specific case and I scale it out to a universal rule? Is that tractable? And once you start thinking that way, you see the problems with, let's say, saying yes to someone who has a request for you to be on a panel or do a 20-minute phone call. That request itself is perhaps small. But if you scale up to the general question of what would happen if I said yes to all of those, you would have no time left. And so we have to basically build a new philosophy from scratch, like Kant was trying to do in the 19th century, just to deal with this new social reality.
Yeah, and well, you actually take it even further in some cases, which is straight up don't respond to email. And you talk about situations in which there may be some short-term negative impact. Maybe somebody thinks less of you if you ignore their email, but that it's important in a sense to set expectations based on what is scalable, and that it's okay in a sense to choose that there are swaths of types of emails that you simply shouldn't respond to. But the obvious question when people hear us talk about that will be, will that not bring negative repercussions over the long term? You argue that it really won't.
Well, what I've discovered is expectations tend to trump accessibility, and we don't always realize this. And so as an author, for example, if you go to my author website and go to the contact page, I don't have a general use email address. I have some specific email addresses for particular purposes, and I have what I call a sender filter with each, which is just a little bit of text that says, here's what this message is for, and here's what you should expect. And that text says for basically all of these, don't expect a response. Now, my worry was, okay, maybe this is going to upset people because I'm no longer as accessible. But it turns out that it doesn't, because what people care about more is expectations. So they're not expecting a response, and so they're not that upset when they don't get one. And the converse of that is when I do respond to someone, it seems like it's an unusually positive event. And so I think we overvalue accessibility and undervalue what people really want is some sort of expectations, some sort of consistency about, should I expect a response or not? Are you going to read this? Are you not? Should I even send this in the first place? So we need to do more work, I think, putting guards, filters, and information around our communication channels and get away from the sort of incredibly low friction, just anyone can reach me at any time about anything type of world, which causes all this confusion.
So to kind of wind down our conversation with what maybe is one of the bigger meta questions about all of this material, if indeed technology continues going in the same direction that it has been, if there's more sort of integration between the human body and a lot of these technologies, as some futurists, although not all, but believe there will be, will the type of approach that you're suggesting be practical if someone wants to live, I guess, what we would call like a normal person? And I know that that's an extremely stigmatizing and heavy sort of loaded term, but I think for our purposes, you sort of know what I mean. Will all of this become impossible if technology continues going in the direction it's been going?
Well, my personal sort of futurist hypothesis is that we're going to see the opposite trend happening. I think one of the biggest impact applications that we're going to see of artificial intelligence that we're not really talking that much about is that it's going to offload quite a bit of the sort of shallow administrative communication type stuff that takes up so much of our, especially professional lives. The model that a lot of large AI players are thinking about is really the chief of staff model, where I have a chief of staff, my sort of Leo McGarry to my Jed Bartlett from the West Wing, like a presidential chief of staff. You have one, everyone has one, but it's implemented by AIs. Those AIs are talking to each other, preserving us to use our brains more focused on the things that our brains do well, sort of here's what you should be working on right now. All the information is here. Think hard about it. Provide something good. The AI will take care of it. And so I think we're actually going to see in the future a significant decrease in the amount of time we spend, let's say, doing shallow communication back and forth, and a significant increase in the time we spend actually thinking hard, because from an economic point of view, that is just a much, much larger return on the capital investment in human brains. If you can get human brains spending most of their time thinking hard about things that only human brains can do, minimize the context switching, minimize the time lost to having to answer emails from HR or setting up meetings or sending back and forth Google invites, you take that all off the plate, you're going to get a huge increase in the amount of value that you get out of this particular capital investment. And so I see a future where, let's say, email or Slack are going to be seen as relatively primitive tools that we had to deal with while waiting for our tech to get where it really needs to get to support a thriving knowledge economy.
Well, that is a nice optimistic note, I feel like, to end what often are sort of dystopian feeling conversations. We've been speaking with Cal Newport, who's a computer science professor at Georgetown University. Make sure to check out his latest book, Digital Minimalism, Choosing a Focused Life in a Noisy World. Cal, really appreciate your time today.
My pleasure.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So I really went back and forth about whether to even do this story today, about how there still is no connection between undocumented immigrants and criminality, because on the one hand, we've already covered this story. It's sort of obvious that this is the case, but there are still so many people who deeply believe, that undocumented immigrants are more likely to commit crimes in the United States. So ultimately, I made the case that it is worth debunking once again. And before I even tell you about the new report, let's just remind ourselves of some of the obvious realities. Coming to the United States illegally is illegal. It can be a misdemeanor or a civil infraction, depending on whether you've overstayed a visa or are crossing the border without permission. That's not what's at issue here, okay? What is at issue here is whether undocumented immigrants do or do not commit more crime than native-born Americans, or more crime than legal immigrants to the United States. And we hear a lot of specific anecdotes from Donald Trump and right-wingers who have propagandized around this about crimes committed by undocumented immigrants. And of course, in a country this big, there are examples of everything. But this is important because our policy towards immigration would be different depending on whether or not undocumented immigrants actually are more likely to commit violent crime and property crime in the United States. But this is pretty obvious. Undocumented immigrants know that they are undocumented. They know that if they get into trouble with the authorities, if they come to the attention of law enforcement, not only could they suffer the penalties for the crime that they commit, but they could be deported. They could get in trouble for being undocumented. So why would a group that knows they have an extra incentive to stay off the radar of law enforcement, why would they commit crimes at a higher rate than native-born Americans and legal immigrants and attract the attention of law enforcement? Yes, we know that poverty and crime are connected. Many undocumented immigrants are poor. But the research has shown for a long time that undocumented immigrants aren't more likely to be violent criminals. And yet again, we have a new study with Pew Research Center data, analyzed by the Marshall Project, which tells us that undocumented immigrants don't increase crime rates. Whether or not undocumented immigration to a metro area increased, the crime rates have continued to slowly decline more or less equally. And in fact, there are many areas with more undocumented immigration that have had even larger decreases in crime, even though it's by a small amount and maybe not statistically significant. Now, this is not to argue that we shouldn't deal with undocumented immigration, which is still a crime, right? Although it's only a civil infraction or a misdemeanor, again, depending on whether you're talking about an overstayed visa or crossing the border without permission. But we cannot allow this discussion to be framed as we have a crisis of violent undocumented immigrants in the United States, because we don't. And this is actually the epitome of how the Republican Party often very successfully influences public opinion. The principle is They take an anecdote and they exploit it to make people scared or angry and to eventually support bad policy that doesn't actually make sense. So let me do an analogy first to abortion. They come out, they say, extreme late-term abortions have to be stopped. Democrats are killing babies. This is horrible. When you look at it, you realize, wait a second, extreme late-term abortion is really rare. And when it's something that takes place, the baby often is going to die anyway, within days or weeks of coming out of the uterus. And it more becomes a question of the life of the mother. It becomes a question of how soon is this fetus going to be determined non-viable. But Republicans use the straw man of the post-birth abortion and all of these crazy things to justify trying to ban abortion altogether. This is the same thing going on with undocumented immigration. An illegal, as they like to say, killed this person. Well, that's a crime. It's a tragedy. It's horrifying, okay? I would not even think of minimizing the horrible nature of that. But the real discussion around undocumented immigration is not actually about crime. It's about economics. It's about culture. It's about geopolitics. It's about diplomacy and foreign relations and foreign policy. That's the real conversation around undocumented immigration. And the problem is that if you actually have the conversation on those terms, instead of about these crimes that Donald Trump and others like to point to, the outcome, the right path forward becomes one that the American right simply doesn't want. It becomes one of working to minimize the circumstances in the source countries of undocumented immigration that make people want to come here to begin with. It becomes an issue of dealing with the economic conditions and the large corporations that are actually a big driver for that undocumented immigration because they are employing undocumented immigrants. If you actually deal with undocumented immigration as an economic, cultural, and geopolitical issue, you can't justify the policies that Republicans want, which is why they have to couch it in these terms of dangerous brown people coming over the border. Yet another study tells us it's absolutely ridiculous. Okay, I did this a couple months ago and people liked it, so I'm going to do it again. I used to do like a weekly book recommendation, and the segments didn't do that well, but people who liked them really did seem to like them. So what I'm doing now is every month or two, I'll just tell you what I've been reading recently, and I'll give you all the recommendations back to back to back. So let me give you some nonfiction recommendations. I recently read Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. This is a book that has been on my to-read list for a long time. Finally picked it up. Absolutely fascinating. Jared Diamond, an extraordinarily interesting guy. And what Guns, Germs, and Steel seeks to answer is the question of why did peoples from certain places do better and become the colonizers rather than the colonizees? I think that's the right word. Than the colonized, maybe to say it another way, beyond just because they had guns and diseases and metal stuff, right? Those would be sort of proximate causes. Yes, those who had guns, germs, and steel tended to become the colonizers rather than the colonized. But the more important question is, why did they end up with guns, germs, and steel before everybody else? And the book is fascinating. It also, by sort of accident in a way, debunks a ton of the race and IQ nonsense that a lot of alt-writers have been circulating for the last several years. Fantastic book. Absolutely a must read. I also recently finished up Bad Blood by John Carreyrou. And Bad Blood is an extraordinarily well-written investigative book by John Carreyrou about the scam that was Theranos, the company formerly run by Elizabeth Holmes, who at one point on paper was worth $4.5 billion by virtue of owning half of Theranos, which at one point was valued at $9 billion. Unfortunately, the entire thing was a scam. And I won't say more. If you've heard of the story, you already probably understand why it's an interesting read. If you haven't, get this book. I read it, I think, in 3 days. It was so compelling. And then last nonfiction suggestion, there is this news guy, Dan Harris, who had sort of like a panic attack breakdown on air several years ago. And he ended up finding meditation and mindfulness and sort of rethinking a lot of elements of his life. And he wrote a book called 10% Happier. And it's really interesting, not so much because of the meditation mindfulness stuff, which I'm already very familiar with, but seeing it from the perspective of an actual person who works in the media. Also a very quick read. I think I read it in like 5 days. So those are some nonfiction recommendations. Fiction. Okay. For new stuff, I recently read Bannerless by Carrie Vaughn, and I liked it. It's not my favorite book, but it is interesting, and it is in a sort of, I don't know if post-apocalyptic is the right word. There has been an incident called the Fall, and humanity has sort of receded, has fallen back in terms of technology and societal sophistication. And it's kind of painting a picture of what the world is like after that fall. And it's entertaining. It's not like my favorite book, but it's a recent book that I really like, enjoyed reading, although it's probably not on like my favorite books list. I also recently read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie. Previously, the only Agatha Christie book I had read was A Murder on the Orient Express, which is, of course, fantastic. But I wanted to read something else by Agatha Christie, so I picked up The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. It's short. It's like 100 pages. And it's really good in that same Agatha Christie style. And then I'm actually rereading John le Carré's book, Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy. I read it like 10 or 12 years ago. This is one of John le Carré's top books, in my opinion. I'm rereading it, and I'm getting just as much out of it in rereading it as I did the first time. So if you haven't read Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy, please do. It's fantastic. We've got a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's a voicemail from an 18-year-old girl who I converted out of conservatism. Take a listen.
Hey, David. My name is Beth. I'm calling from Corpus Christi. I'm 18. I've been watching your show for a few months now. I grew up really Republican, and ever since Trump started, his campaign back in 2016, I was like, where is any of the logic in this anymore? People seem to just blindly follow him. I found your channel a couple months ago, and I've been watching ever since, and you've proved to be an amazing role model for me. I love how logical you are, how calm you are, and you don't get fired up about things. And it reminds me that there is still some rationality in this world. And I've used a lot of the things you've taught me to be able to educate others. So you are making a difference in this next generation. I just want to let you know.
Wow. What an inspirational message. I mean, seriously, it is great. That's the stuff that I love to hear. Because listen, I get thousands of negative messages a day, most of them based on either my hair or my ethnicity or my national origin, ad hominems of all different kinds. But that is exactly why this show exists. And it's also why, by the way, when you say what you're doing, David, is good enough to support financially with a membership, that's exactly what we are funding. We are funding reaching people who aren't in positions to pay for programs like this, but who are actually having their lives changed. The direction of that person, of this great young girl, has now been changed as a result of progressive independent media from a life of Trumpism, I mean, come on, to a life of logic and reason and thinking critically. We've got a great bonus show for you today. Become a member. You'll be helping people like that great caller we just heard from, and you'll get access to extra content like the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.